the air and streaming on the web since 1996, this is the Cinematic Sound Radio Network.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's episode of the flagship show on the Cinematic Sound Radio podcast. I'm your host, Eric Woods, and today we're presenting a very special show. This is our second show programmed by one of our very own Patreon supporters. And just in case you're wondering, our Patreon is at patreon.com/cinematic sound radio. We'd love for you to join the community. Now, for those that signed up for Patreon in the conductor tier, which is currently sold out, they got the opportunity to program their very own 1 hour-ish show. So they get to pick all the tracks, and I play them for them right here on the show. Now, a few months back, we aired Alan Rogers' Scottish film music program, where all the tracks were selected by Alan himself. Today, Max Hamulyak is up to the plate, and I think you're going to enjoy what he has in store for you. So let's begin. And first of all, let's get you introduced to Max. So, in his own words, he has this to say. Eric, I want to congratulate you again on the 25-year milestone. That is amazing. Having to create my selection for my conductor tier Patreon broadcast, I have a newfound respect for you. It was tough to narrow down my music library to an hour of content. My iTunes library has over 35,000 songs with a duration of around 72 days. I could probably have filled my entire hour with just one composer. Let me shortly introduce myself. I'm a 26-year-old software engineer from the Netherlands. I have a passion in mythology, science fiction, fantasy, and obviously film music. I think that will reflect somewhat in my choices here. As a child, my father often played this game during dinner for my siblings, and for me to guess the instrument or the classical composer. Perhaps that nudged me in the direction of film music. Who knows? Twitter does not share information on when you followed someone publicly, but I was able to find an interaction in 2016, so I've been a fan of the program for at least since then. I started by looking for podcasts to more easily discover new music, and boy, did I discover gems from classics to video games to documentaries. I was especially a fan of those big end-of-the-year lists that covered the best of music in a given year. I came for the music, but I stayed for the thorough background information I learned on composers, scores, and movies. So I jumped at the chance to become a Patreon member. And Max, I thank you very much for supporting the show the way that you do, and I am really excited about presenting your tracks here on the program today. Max continues. So on to my choices then. I chose tracks from about 4 minutes and up, so it would be more like lengthy suites. For the, quote, all Patreons request show, unquote, I went with Bear McCreary's Storming New Caprica, a series and composer I thoroughly enjoy, but since space is very limited in the hour, I did not pick him this time. I think, though, there's something in this playlist for everyone. So let's begin with some honorable mentions that I might save for my next episode. Here they are. Mark Streitenfeld's Robin Hood, Trevor Rabin's National Treasure, Alan Silvestri's Ready Player One, Steve Jablonsky's Battleship, Fernando Velasquez's Hercules, and Joseph LaDuca's Librarians. All interesting choices, Max, and so I hope we get a chance to hear them on the next show that you program. So Max's first selection is Schindler's List, with music composed by John Williams, featuring violinist Ishtak Perlman. Max has this to say about the track. On my list of tracks, the master himself could not be missing. In 2019 with Across the Stars and Sophie Mutter, and in 2020 with John Williams in Vienna, I rediscovered some gems that I had not thought about in years. I could have easily selected amongst my favorite tracks from Harry Potter, for example, Prisoner of Azkaban's The Window to the Past, or the majestic theme for Jurassic Park. Settled is not the right word, but I settled on the theme for Schindler's List because for me, I can feel the raw emotion in the music. Music from Schindler's List, composed by John Williams. Next up is music from The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, on the track Sons of Doran. Max has this to say about the track. Growing up, one of my favorite books was not Lord of the Rings, but its prequel, The Hobbit. I was very intrigued by this story about dwarves, so I was thrilled to see it made into a movie, especially after the success of The Lord of the Rings on the big screen. Even though the film took liberties with the source material, I enjoyed them as a whole. I think composer Howard Shore did a fantastic job bringing these movies to life. Across all the extended editions of these scores, there are so many great sequences to choose from. I often revisit the lighting of the beacons, the prologue, One Ring to Rule Them All, and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. But for today's episode, I opted for the track Sons of Durin, since I thoroughly enjoyed the sequence where the dwarves are rallying and giving pushback to the invading goblins. Music from The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. Composed by Howard Shore. That was the track Sons of Durin.
On the air and streaming on the web since 1996, this is the Cinematic Sound Radio Network.
This is the Cinematic Sound Radio Podcast. My name is Eric Woods, and this is the flagship show. On today's program, we're featuring a Patreon member special. This is a show programmed by Max Hamulyak. The next track comes from the film Troy, with original score composed by James Horner, and the track Achilles Leads the Myrmidons. Max has this to say about the cue. Another one of the masters made my list, and it's a shame he's no longer amongst us. I am, of course, talking about James Horner. I often revisit his orchestral scores, and I love the use of horns in it. For me, a score I can vividly see the on-screen action comes from Troy. So here is Achilles Leads the Myrmidons. Achilles leads the Myrmidons, from Troy, with original score composed by James Horner. Max's next selection comes from Valkyrie, with music by John Ottman, and the cue Operation Valkyrie. Max has this to say about the cue. The second World War II score to make my list is Operation Valkyrie by John Ottman. This time not for the emotion in the track, but as an action sequence I enjoy. For me, the use of the drums perfectly captures the sense of urgency during the coup in the attempt to end the war. Music from the film Valkyrie, with original score composed by John Ottman, and that was the track Operation Valkyrie. Max's next track is a barn burner. This is Knives and Bullets and Cannons 2 from Dario Marianelli's exceptional score from V for Vendetta. Max has this to say about the cue. As I already talked about omitting Bear McCreary on this list, who is, in my humble opinion, a composer who is excellent in the use of non-ordinary instruments like the hurdy-gurdy, a composer who is also known for this is Dario Marianelli, for example, Typewriters in Atonement. So here is a lengthy action track from V for Vendetta. That was a cue from V for Vendetta, music composed by Dario Marinelli. The track was called Knives and Bullets and Cannons Too. We got to take a quick 30-second break, but we'll be right back right after this.
APM Music offers limitless potential for your creative content. No matter the genre or mood, all the music you need is on one platform. And you don't have to worry about licensing. APM's got that covered. Need help finding the perfect track? APM's dedicated music directors can deliver curated options designed specifically for your creative vision. APM's website uses best-in-class search technology, so finding the perfect track is easier than ever. Find your sound at apmmusic.com.
You're listening to the flagship show on the Cinematic Sound Radio Network with your host, Eric Woods.
Welcome back to the program. This is the flagship show here on the Cinematic Sound Radio podcast. I hope you're enjoying today's program. Today's program is made possible by our Patreon supporters. This is a Patreon member-produced program. Max Hamulyak signed up for the conductor tier at our Patreon, which is at patreon.com/cinematicsoundradio. And in that tier, he earned the opportunity to program his own program, which is what he is doing today. The next track he wants to play for us comes from Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End, with music by Hans Zimmer and the track One Day. Max has this to say about the cue. My first memory of actively choosing to listen to film music is Hans Zimmer. I am, of course, talking about Pirates of the Caribbean. Even retroactively, I vividly remember watching The Lion King and the scene where Simba returns to his homeland. That's just the impact music can make. I prefer the 1990s to the early 2000s Zimmer to his recent work, but perhaps that is because of the trips down memory lane. Other than Pirates, I enjoy Crimson Tide, The Rock, Gladiator, Last Samurai, and King Arthur. That's not even considering his work for Christopher Nolan on Batman with James Newton Howard or Kung Fu Panda with John Powell. I seriously debated amongst Last Samurai, King Arthur, and Pirates for a while, but since Pirates is one of my first scores I actively remember, here is One Day from Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. the track One Day from Pirates of the Caribbean, At World's End, with music by Hans Zimmer. Max's next track is a lengthy one. It's the Jurassic World Suite, composed by Michael Giacchino. Here's why Max chose the track. Asked to pick a favorite composer is, I imagine, like picking your favorite child. But if I had to, Michael Giacchino would likely be on top. Ranging from his video game work to his space operas, there's just so much to choose from. Listening to his music always puts a smile on my face, if only because of the Giacchino puns in the track titles. However, today, I pick a selection from his work on the Jurassic Park franchise. Since I did not pick that for John Williams, I'm able to get a bit of both in this track. That was the Jurassic World suite from Jurassic World, with music composed by Michael Giacchino. Up next, Max has created a little suite for us from 4 different scores. So here's what Max has to say about this little suite of his. The next few tracks are by far shorter than the rest of this list, but I could not keep them out. So you're going to first hear music from Queen's Gambit, by far my favorite score of 2020. Could not be missing out on that show. Composed by Carlos Rafael Rivera. Then we're going to play music from Tale of a Lake, a score I discovered by listening to Cinematic Sound Radio. Thank you, Max. And the original score is composed by Finnish composer Panu Altio. And then The Duchess, the only female composer on my list, and one I discovered through Cinematic Sound Radio. The score is composed by the great Rachel Portman. And then Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, one of the best tracks in the franchise after John Williams left it. This scene by Dame Maggie Smith is so iconic, it could not be left out. And the original score for Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows was composed by Alexandre Desplat. So here now, The Queen's Gambit, Tale of a Lake, The Duchess, and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. That was a suite of music featuring 4 cues. The suite began with Queen's Gambit by Carlos Rafael Rivera, then Tale of a Lake by Pano Alto, then The Duchess by Rachel Portman, and the suite ended with Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, with music by Alexandre Desplat.
On the air and streaming on the web since 1996, this is the Cinematic Sound Radio Network.
Well, we sadly come to the end of today's program, and I just want to thank Max Hamulyak one more time for going through the effort of picking these tracks and writing a little script for me. And I think this was a fantastic program. And again, Max, thank you very much for supporting Cinematic Sound Radio by joining the Cinematic Sound Radio Patreon. If you want to become a member of the Cinematic Sound Radio Patreon, getting the opportunity to join the community, our Cinematic Sound Radio family over there, then head over to patreon.com/Cinematic Sound Radio and sign up for one of the available tiers, and you can sign up for as low as $1. And well, the last track that Max has chosen for us comes from one of my all-time favorite scores, and one of the greatest scores, I think, of all time, one of the greatest scores written this century. It's How to Train Your Dragon by John Powell. Here's what Max has to say about this track. The franchise How to Train Your Dragon has to be my favorite animated movie franchise of them all. I think there's something unique to most scores for animated films. Somehow they feel much freer, for the lack of a better word. It just reaches more emotions for me. For example, in the track Stoic's Ship, you can feel the sorrow in it. But I want to end with a powerful track. So here is This Is Burke by John Powell. And I hope you enjoyed the program. Max, as I said, you did a fantastic job. Thank you very much for curating this list for us, and we look forward to your next list sometime down the road. And that's it for today's program. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Eric Woods, and I have been your host. And until next time, take care wherever you are in this world, and happy listening. Thank you for tuning in to the Cinematic Sound Radio Network. I want to thank Tim Burton for providing his voice for all the bumpers and stingers you hear throughout the show, and to David Coscina for providing Cinematic Sound Radio's intro music. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email us at cinematicsound@yahoo.com. You can find us on social media at CinSound Radio on Twitter, at Cinematic Sound on Facebook, and from wherever you're listening to us today, please leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review. Reviews help introduce potential new listeners to the show. While you're at it, head over to TeePublic to find yourself a Cinematic Sound Radio t-shirt and support us on Patreon by going to patreon.com/cinematicsoundradio. And don't forget to check out Cinematic Sound Radio at cinematicsound.net.